Well, good morning if you are in San Francisco, California. Good afternoon if, like me, you're in New York City. Good early evening if you're in Kidderminster in the United Kingdom. And later than that, if you're in Berlin or Moscow or Mumbai or Tokyo or Sydney, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the weekly show, Fred Plotkin on Fridays. That must mean that I'm Fred Plotkin. And I have as my guest every week someone who inspires me. In some cases, they're people I've known, as in today's guest. In other cases, people I've never met, but I just wanted to have them on. Today's guest is Matthew Schilvock, the general director of the San Francisco Opera. I believe you are CEO and general director of the San Francisco Opera, and the funder's name is Taub. Is that correct?
Tad and Diane Toby,
Toby.
uh,
It
two,
looks
two of
like
our
Taub.
wonderful sponsors, yes. But they throw the CEO in for good measure.
Oh, very good. So, Matthew, the audiences should know we know each other. Um, I did a little research today about your predecessors, and I was amazed to discover something. We're going to talk about the San Francisco Opera, founded in 1923. You
Yes,
are the seventh general director.
that's right.
I've known six of the seven, and I'm not ancient. The one I did not know was Gaetano Merilla, who founded the company in 1923 and died in 1953 in the orchestra pit, if I remember correctly.
On
Is
the
that
on the podium at Stern Grove, which is an outdoor venue here in San Francisco, and he was conducting, I believe, Madame Butterfly in an
yes?
outdoor festival there. But yes, he sadly passed away on the podium.
Wow. And then next came Kurt Herbert Adler, who I knew when I was a very young man, and then Terry Mcewan to everyone,
Mhm.
a Canadian and a recording. He came from the recording industry and from London Decca Records, and he was a great friend of singers, and singers loved him. And it was a period when it's fair to say San Francisco Opera was a singer's house,
Right.
where they were brought in on the strength of their voices. He was followed by Lotfi Mansouri, who was an
Mhm.
excellent stage director. And while it remained a singer's house, it also became more of a theatrical venue. And then there was Pamela Rosenberg, who is
Mhm.
a San Franciscan, uh, I believe, unlike a lot of the others. And she had a
Yeah,
relatively,
she
pardon
studied
me?
at Berkeley. She studied at Berkeley, and so it was a nice coming home from that. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And she, therefore, she spent a lot of time in Europe, and I think her
Mhm.
formation is more in a European way. And then David Gockley, who is your mentor, who was at the Houston Grand Opera for many, many years, and you, as a younger man, studied with him and learned from him. And when he moved to San Francisco after a very long tenure in Houston, you came along and were in the administration. That's when I met you. And then you
That's
were
right.
associate or assistant general director. And then when David Gockley retired, you became general director. So the fact that I've known six of the seven general directors of San Francisco Opera kind of stunned me. But it's a very interesting history because I would say that each one of these people left a very strong imprint on the company.
Uh-huh.
And you do too. And I think that's a very good thing. But I think more than most companies, not all, I mean, Lyric Opera of Chicago, maybe you could talk about the different eras of the different general directors. The
Right.
Metropolitan Opera, which is my home company, yes, but also the presence of artistic directors and other characteristics at the Met that make it different from San Francisco and Chicago. I will add one thing that for people who are listening abroad, typically in the United States, we talk about the top four companies, and those are the Met, Chicago, San Francisco, and Houston. And they're each very different. These are among our largest cities. Los Angeles is a larger city than San Francisco, but has its own particular history of not having had opera much of its own creation until relatively late. They have a very fine company now. But
Well, we in San Francisco used to go down and play at the Shrine Auditorium. So we in LA. So we delivered opera into LA for many years. I forget quite how many, but I think through the 70s, maybe, and before that, there was a regular touring from San Francisco down to LA.
And they also had New York City Opera for many years under Beverly Sills. And you may not know this fact, but the Metropolitan Opera, in its earliest years, you well know that they toured in California because the Met was there for the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. But people don't know that the American premiere of Puccini's La Boheme was given by the Metropolitan Opera, not in New York, but in Los Angeles.
I didn't know that.
Wow. Yeah. So LA it's a wonderful cultural city, but it has its own particular characteristics. A fantastic symphony orchestra that somehow for many years dominated, and of course the film industry. And to me, and if you want to talk about this, feel free to me, I always describe film as being the outgrowth of opera. And that they're in many ways similar in terms of creating great pictures and large emotions, but the difference being is that in opera, the primary narrative medium is music, although film has great music and many opera composers have written for film. And in film, the primary medium is words, not music. And both have a lot of big pictures. And I think maybe what inhibited LA a bit was having the film industry. Yes, Berlin has a film industry in Paris and Rome, but Rome is not the biggest opera city in Italy. So I think there's more of a comparison there that Rome and LA, being big cinema centers, were a bit behind operatically. I don't know what you think on that.
Well, it's an interesting comparison of those two cities. I mean, I think what LA is doing now under Christopher's leadership there, Christopher Couch, is just extraordinary. I mean, and I think of all of the opera communities in the US, Los Angeles is able to do some really interesting work. There's a very kind of more avant-garde culture, I would say, with regard to entertainment and risk-taking and so forth. And Los Angeles has really been on the vanguard of that. So I think that there's a real blossoming of opera happening in Los Angeles at the moment, which is
I agree
exciting.
with you. And so this brings up a delicate topic that I talk about with my San Francisco friends and family. New York, where I'm from, and San Francisco, where you live, are politically, socially among the most liberal, progressive cities in the United States, if not the world. And yet, I find in audiences in New York and San Francisco for opera, certainly in symphony, a degree of conservatism and traditionalism that cities such as Houston and Los Angeles don't have, where the audiences seem to be much more adventurous. And maybe it's the old traditions that we have in New York and San Francisco that created that.
I think there's a few elements that, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's definitely, well, in both cases, there's the lineage. I mean, you talked about that with San Francisco already, and the lineage of these companies that, of course, the Met goes back longer than we do. But to be in these companies where you've had people like Flagstadt singing, you know, Brunhilde and Isolde on the stage, and these moments, we did the American premiere of Frauner Schatten and things like that. So you've got these amazing markers that really have been some of the great moments in American opera history. And so I think that lineage is an important part of that, because whatever we do now is tied in that artistic progression. So I think that's an important part of it. And there's many people in the audience who, and the number of subscribers we have who have been with us for 50 years, 60 years, it's amazing. And I love when that can happen. In fact, we've started doing something in the last few years where my box, which is the one closest to the stage on stage right, we've invited some of the 50-year plus subscribers to sit there just as on their anniversaries, because it's to have devoted that much of your life to that company deserves celebration. There's another element, though, I would say, and I think particularly for those two houses, and I've thought about this a lot lately, it's what the proscenium does, the particular proscenium you have in that opera house. And, you know, a proscenium is a frame, right? And it's a picture frame, basically. And we happen to have a very, very heavily gilded picture frame, and the Met to some degree as well. And I think how you perceive art can't be divorced from the setting in which it's happening in. And you think about watching an opera in San Francisco with this amazingly beautiful gold Beaux-Arts proscenium versus watching it at the Bastille, for example, where the proscenium disappears into the blackness of the surroundings. So I've thought more and more about that lately, the role that the frame itself, the frame of the building, plays in how audiences see theater. We had an interesting experience a few years ago, Fred. We did the American debut of Calixto Beato when we did his Carmen production. I think we may still be the only American company to have done a Beato production.
I came for it. I saw it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And that production is, by Calixto's standards, relatively moderate and not particularly egregious, or didn't push the envelope that much. And I think for us, we loved doing it because it spoke a lot to the what the inner core of Carmen as a story, and what that piece is, and the way that he tries to get into the world of the smugglers, and the suffering and the motivations for these characters and why they're doing what they're doing. And we had many in the audience who loved it, but we had many who didn't appreciate it. Some of whom maybe you would say, sort of more from a traditional perspective, it wasn't the Carmen that they expected. But we had a lot of young people in their 20s and 30s who were kind of shocked by it as well. And I was thinking a lot about that, because oftentimes we think about, well, if we can bring something that is more contemporary, more cutting edge, then we can bring in new audiences. And I think sometimes that's true. But I think there's also a disconnect in expectation when you take a piece like that and you have an audience who's coming for the first time and they've saved up, maybe it's a big important date that they're on, or a big celebration, a wedding anniversary or something. And they have this idea, and I call it the Pretty Woman moment, when Julia Roberts is sitting in, and it's supposed to be in San Francisco Opera in Box C, watching Traviata happening on stage, like her story happening on stage, basically, in Traviata. And, she's just completely overwhelmed with emotion. And I think many times that's what people anticipate. They're going to have this very, very emotional connection and this beautiful setting. They've got dressed up and so forth. And so you have that, and then you have the potentially a disconnect in expectation with what's on stage. You thought you knew Carmen, and now suddenly there's 5 Mercedes cars on stage, and what's going on? I think that can sometimes be a challenge, but again, it comes back to the venue. Like if you were watching that in the Bastille, I just use that as an example because the proscenium is basically just a black frame. I think you would see it in a different way versus this very sort of opulent, gilded, velvet opera house. So that's a long-winded way of answering a question, but
it's important. And I'm going to take 2 things that you addressed and take them further. Both of them actually are things that I get a lot of pushback on, because I'm certainly not politically conservative, and I'm not artistically conservative, but I would call myself classical, as opposed to conservative or traditionalist. That I believe that the inspiration and the thinking and the North Star when you do an opera production is the actual work itself, and
right.
not the concept of the director. But that said, I am not a big fan when many opera houses, but especially old gold ones like the Met in San Francisco and a few in Europe, do productions where they create new curtains for the production. And there are 2 reasons for that. One, frankly, is from a budgetary point of view, that cost extra money. And the house usually has its own beautiful curtain. In Vienna, they create a new curtain for every season, and that's fine, because then you have the curtain of the season. But failing that, I know at the Met we have this beautiful gold silk curtain that it's called a Wagner curtain. It sort of creates a frame and can be fully lifted, removed, raised, or create sort of a picture, a frame around it if you're doing a very traditional production. And audience members, many of us, loved that curtain. But also the great thing about it, among many things, is that it provides for a traditional curtain call, where the singer steps out from the backstage from that world we were just in to the curtain call. That's what it's called, that. And gets to have the adulation of the audience, have better lighting, and be seen and acknowledged. And also it kind of separates from the end of the opera. When productions now raise this painted curtain and you see the artist deep into the stage, it's fine for what we call a tableau, where you'll have the chorus and company members, but then bring in the curtain and have curtain calls. La Scala does that every single time, no matter what the show is. And it's an extra moment. And it's very gratifying for the singers. Frankly, in New York, audience members go rushing out if they
That's
don't
part of the
see
problem,
the
right?
curtain. And I want the artist to be acknowledged for their work. So, but many, many, many people, especially younger people, say to me, no, we don't like the gold curtain. It's too traditional. It connotes something that's not who we are. I don't know how you feel about a so-called house curtain as opposed to a show curtain made for each show.
It's a great question. I think the house curtain plays a role in the identity of the house. And it's interesting because our house curtain would generally go out kind of in a valance feel. So you'll sort of pick it up at various points, and it will lift kind of in a series of swags. And we had to replace. We had to do a major repair job on the curtain some years ago, and so it was out of commission. And we had a gold kind of velour curtain instead, which was kind of a shadow of the beauty of the house curtain. But what was interesting is when they replaced the curtain, I don't know exactly what the mechanism inside, but the mechanism that basically pulls the curtain up within the fabric, they replaced. I think it used to be a sort of metal structure, and now it's a plastic structure inside. And what you lost in that actually was the rattle of the curtain when it went out. And if you listen to the old radio broadcasts from the 70s and so forth, you'll hear that characteristic rattle when the curtain goes out. And it's and I actually found myself missing that. And now you have beautiful silence. The curtain goes out in silence, which you'd think would be preferable, but I do actually miss that rattle a little bit. I think the curtain plays an important role. We're talking about picture frames. I mean, the curtain plays this important role in signaling things as well. And sometimes, the director doesn't want that divide. They want you to walk into the world, and you'll have a kind of either a preset on stage, maybe even a kind of a mute show where something is happening, and not that often, but sometimes that'll happen. Sometimes there's a feeling like there's such a big disconnect between that gold and where you're going with it that they'd rather just have a black or something. So I think it can depend on the piece. I think it is an important part of the symbolism and of the ritual of going to the company. Now, sometimes you want to subvert that, and that's okay. What we struggle with actually is when directors want to use the curtain coming back in a dramatic way. And I've had a number of situations in the last year where we'll be in the rehearsals, and I'll realize that they're doing a very slow bring in of the curtain, like at the end of Traviata or something, and they just want the stage picture to close down as the music closes down. And I will always say to the director, that's not going to work. The minute that curtain moves, someone starts clapping. And they'll say, no, it's going to be, you're in the moment. They'll understand it's coming down. I'm like, no. It's, and sometimes we'll let it play out, and in the dress rehearsal, it'll happen, and the applause will start, and they're like, no, it's not ready. We're not ready for the applause yet. But, and I don't know if that's a newer thing or not, because it's something which, again, we have to work through in a number of shows. But, you can do it with lighting. You can have the lighting fade out. That's fine. But the minute that curtain goes, maybe it's unique to our house, but the minute that curtain starts moving, the show is over, basically.
I think it's really an American thing.
Yeah.
Because when I go to opera in Europe, that doesn't happen. And unless there are Americans in the audience. And, I'm glad that we're enthusiastic people. And I know many, many opera singers who love coming to the States because we are enthusiastic as an audience. But the trade-off is there was a grand old Italian conductor named Nello Santi, who I knew very well. And he was a very genial man, except when he was conducting the last notes of Aida, for example. I'm never saying pace, pace imploro, pace. And the curtain would begin to come in, or the lights would go down on Aida and Radames, and the audience would start applauding, and he'd go, shh, zitti. In Italian, that means shut up. Zitti, c'è la musica. There's still music to play. The second question I was going to ask you, I'm going to put off because you raised another point that I want to talk about that I love in San Francisco. Not 2 years ago, but maybe 4 years ago when I was there, I come frequently. You had a scene change with the curtain up to an act change to show the audience what happens backstage. How did that idea come about, and talk about its impact?
Well, if memory serves, Fred, it came out of, we had done some work with the Stanford Design School, which is this idea of design thinking, which is all about iterative testing and, starting with prototypes and working things up rather than just coming up with the grand idea and throwing everything at it. So we had done some work with the Stanford Design School, D School, and it led us to think about various prototypes that we could run. And one of them was around this idea of how do you let audiences behind the scenes much more? It's wonderful if you can take someone on a backstage tour. It can be life-changing for someone to do that, but you can't really do that at scale. So how do you give more of the audience that glimpse of the inner workings of a production? And so we tried this idea, we called it an open curtain, and we picked a couple of performances where we tried it out, and we let people know in advance that we were doing it. And for most people, it's been really amazing, and we get a lot of people staying in their seats. Actually, the concessionaire, I think, doesn't like the open curtains because they keep people away from the bars. But people are just fascinated by the craft and the technique of what happens behind that curtain when you try and move sets. And sometimes, you have amazingly interesting set changes, like the recent Mcewan Rusalka we did. I mean, that set change is, that is an entire production in and of itself, moving those sets, particularly in San Francisco, because the backstage height clearance is a little bit less than Chicago. So in Chicago, they could just roll the unit back. In San Francisco, we had to literally dismantle the roof of it in the intermission. So that's an amazing thing to see. Other times, if you're on a unit set, obviously less to see, but you can always talk about something, what's happening with the lighting, what's happening with costume changes and so forth. And so we have a couple of staff members who will go out and do that, taking questions on social media from the audience. There's definitely people who don't appreciate it. Some people don't want to see the sausage being made, and they want the mystique of it. And so we've learned over time to allow at least a few minutes so that those who don't want to do that can exit the theater and maintain the mystery of how you get from A to B in the theater. But people generally, I would say, are just fascinated by this. And the other thing which I've done actually since taking on this job is every couple of weeks when we're in season, I put out something called Backstage with Matthew, and it's just a blog, but essentially it's an interview that I do with someone in the company, and it's very personal. I do it myself. I take my own photos, and it's showcasing who they are and the work they do and the crafts they do, and everything from someone on the crew to the rehearsal department to singers. It's all aspects of it, and that's what I love about this business. It's just we have just hundreds of different skills, and something like the hand painting on a piece of fabric, which allows that fabric to resonate from 100 feet away in the back of the balcony, but it's not something that you sit there.
There's actually a special verb for that. It's called distressing.
Yeah, exactly.
When you do hand painting, and if someone not in the opera profession, if you ask them about distressing, they would say, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that." No, it's a good thing. It means we're painting a costume or a piece of scenery to have a different texture from a distance with lighting.
Right. And the techniques of that, I mean, I'm always amazed by the Pannell sets, and there aren't that many of them now in utilization. We still have a couple, but it's, you look at those sets close up, and there's like nothing. It seems kind of remedial, and you're not quite sure what you're looking at. You walk back into the house, you put the right lighting on, and suddenly you have this very realistic scenery. And so that those whole techniques of scenic painting and construction, and we're now building new productions of core classic repertoire, like the new Tosca we did. We're in the middle of Mozart da Ponte cycle. And the charge that we've given is that they need to last for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And so the scene shop is actually using very specific techniques which they haven't used for a while around scenic painting. Rather than painting directly onto wood, they'll paint onto a kind of muslin fabric, or maybe like a Hessian fabric, so that that is a technique that is used to preserve the length of a show. So all of these techniques, it's amazing.
I'm going to talk to our listeners now in Austria, Switzerland, Germany, France, Finland, countries where there is generous public support of the arts, and therefore, if you do a Rigoletto that is set on the Planet of the Apes, then the audience doesn't like it, then you do another Rigoletto 2 years later. We can't do that in America because we can't afford, frankly, to think of getting rid of a Rigoletto after 2 years. And therefore, what you say may sound strange to someone in Europe, that we in America would build for 40 years, because that's how budgeting works if we're going to do a broad range of opera repertory.
Yeah.
And I know it sounds strange to people elsewhere.
I think as well.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Fred, like in even in a smaller German house, for example, there is much more of a regular rotation of repertoire as well, right? So you might see that Rigoletto every year, or even twice a year. In some cases, it will come back. Whereas for us, we try and sort of space out so that the subscribers are getting a good blend. So you may not see that Rigoletto more than like once every 5 years. And so we have to kind of look at those bigger timelines, I think, as well.
And I didn't plan to raise this, but since we're talking about Rigoletto, you did it a few years ago, and I was in San Francisco. I try to be there a lot, as you know. Mm-hmm. And this cast had wonderful singers, and it was a fine production. What struck me particularly, the singers were just outstanding. There was the American baritone Quinn Kelsey, who was Hawaiian, and he was, to me, a known quantity, but just really became a burst out star with this Rigoletto, which he now does wherever the audiences are lucky to get him. And Penne Patti, was that the name of the tenor?
Penne Patti, yes.
Would you talk about this gentleman?
Oh, Fred, Penne is extraordinary, and he a New Zealander, a Samoan singer, and he came to our attention when Sherry Greenwald, who just retired as the head of our Young Artist Training Program, she went to New Zealand along with the Director of Musical Studies then, Mark Morash, and they did a series of auditions and masterclasses and so forth, and had a number of singers come from all around New Zealand, one of whom was Penne. Another of whom was a wonderful soprano, Amina Edris, and that was the time at which Penne and Amina met, but that's a whole other part of the story here. They're now married. And so Penne came to our attention. We immediately offered him a slot in the Merrill program, which is a
Merrill program being your great educational program.
Yeah. Our summer program. And after he had finished, and there's just such an effortless quality to his singing. I mean, it's sort of that Pavarotti type feel of just complete exuberance in song, and there's no tension at all. It's just completely natural. And so we offered him a slot in the Adler program, which is a more focused 2-year residency program that comes out of Merrill. And that was a challenge at the time because Penne is also, and still is, part of a group called Sole Mio with his brother and his cousin. And they have this and it's kind of a crossover classical pop group. And they've toured heavily within New Zealand, also in the UK, and they have a few albums out as well. And he didn't feel like he could step away from that, because it was really that was how he and his family were making money. And so if he stepped away from that, the whole thing would have to be put on pause. So he continued to do that. And a couple of years after that, we kept pushing and pushing, and we eventually got him into the Adler program. And, as you know, Fred, I mean, we try and use the Adlers in many ways on stage, and sometimes they will go into leading roles, usually because they're a cover and they get their lucky break. With Penne, we said, no, we need to put him into the role of the Duke and have him do the whole run. So we did that, and that's sort of an unusual situation for an Adler, but again, just the effortless quality of his voice. And he was supposed to come back and do it again last fall. It was supposed to be our season opener, and of course was cancelled along with so much else. But I'll tell you a funny story, Fred, on that particular Rigoletto, because we had Penne in the cast. We also had Quinn, as you say, and we had Penne's brother Amitai as well, and he was in the cast as well. And we were in the middle of the run, and I can't remember how the call came in, but we got a call to say that the Queen of Tonga was in town and she wanted to visit. And so I'm suddenly like British guy, fascinated by the royal family. I'm like, oh my gosh, we've got to get the protocol right here. We've got to do this right. And she was coming in a private capacity, and I think she had family in the Bay Area and to come to visit. But I was like, we've got to do this right. And so I just default to what I know from watching, the royal family being backstage at, the Royal Opera or something, and you have the lineup of people on backstage. So we arranged to do that. And I went to meet her at intermission. We had a nice chat, and then I took her backstage at the end. And she went down the line of the cast, and because you had Hawaiian and 2 Samoans there, and it was amazing because she was giving them greetings in Samoan, and they were giving her greetings back, and it was one of the most glorious moments I have had. And
did
then at the
subject of rugby come up at all?
It may have done between them.
Okay,
not me. I'm not your man for that. But at the end, because again, it was a private visit, and it's she had some people with her, and they were going to collect the car, and it was taking forever. So I went down with her onto Venice Avenue in front of the Opera House, and couldn't find this car anywhere. I'm standing on Venice with the Queen of Tonga, like trying to figure out if I should call an Uber for her, and it was it was a very memorable evening in the very best of ways. So
I just thought about something, Matthew. When you and I talk, it triggers all kinds of ideas. Initially, the United Nations, the first meetings to create the United Nations were in San Francisco.
Yep.
And there was talk of having the UN being in San Francisco for its base. It wound up being in New York City. And I remember from my years as performance manager at the Met that we had many kings, queens, dignitaries, ambassadors, and so on come to the Met all the time. And there were all kinds of preparations, and I could write a whole book just on dealing with Indira Gandhi and Henry Kissinger and Bill Clinton and Nancy Reagan, who I got to know very well. And
I want to read that book, Fred.
Pardon me?
I want to read that book.
Maybe sometime I'll come do a talk for you. But I mean, just Indira Gandhi and Nancy Reagan, 2 wonderful stories right there. And I'm a liberal Democrat. Nancy Reagan and I became very good friends. And it was so interesting that we just put aside our politics and found commonality in our love of opera and the arts. And very interesting. And the way she thought about supporting the arts, it was a good thing. But the fact that we have the United Nations in New York and that international scene, which makes it different, say, from even Washington or London with all the ambassadors. The UN through the year is a constant feed and influence in our culture in New York. And I wonder what San Francisco, which is a very diverse city, would have been like. This is just speculation
Mm-hmm.
had the UN opened there instead of New York? What do you think?
Oh, that's fascinating. Fascinating thought. Yeah, it was sad because last year was the 75th anniversary of the UN, and the plenary sessions were held in the Opera House. In fact, there's a wonderful photo of the War Memorial stage, with the dais with all the flags and so forth, and then the UN Charter itself was signed next door in the sister building, the Veterans Building, and the little Herbst Theater there, and there were big plans to celebrate that, and of course all of that got cancelled last year. I think it would be a very different city, because I think one of the things that strikes me is, San Francisco, west coast of America, is so far from anywhere. It's as someone who comes from the UK, I'm very conscious of how distant we are from many, many places, and that has a lot of implications in terms of both artists' willingness to come out, because you once you're there, you're there. You can't go down the road and do another gig in the next town over, kind of thing. And also, I think for audiences, from a cultural perspective, they only are really seeing what we're doing. It's not like you jump on a train in Germany and go and see your neighbor sitter's ring cycle or something. So we have a sort of very singular relationship with our audience in that regard. What has happened in recent years, maybe our own little version of the United Nations, when we do the big opening weekend concert at Golden Gate Park, we've developed a tradition of bringing in the consular corps, and Charlotte Schultz, who is the head of protocol for San Francisco, and the wife of Secretary George Schultz, who very sadly just passed away a few weeks ago, they made it a personal commitment to bring the consular corps to the opera in the park. And so, very regularly, for every opening weekend, we have that connection with the consular corps. So it just made me think about that with the UN. It's that's our own nod to that, I think.
I want to tell something to listeners who have not been to San Francisco that makes the city and its opera and so on rather unique in a wonderful way, in a much more European way than I can think of in any American city. Namely, we all know San Francisco has hills, and many of the streets are of medium width, but there is one very large, broad avenue that covers much of the length of the city. It's called Venice Avenue. And Venice Avenue has a string of very beautiful, important public buildings. And one of them is the City Hall. Now, the City Hall has a dome that was influenced by the Dome of St. Peter's in Rome. So much so that when I was in San Francisco recently, I was walking up a hill, I turned around and photographed it with a cypress tree, and I sent it on
Wow.
Facebook, and I said, "Greetings from Rome," and very few people said, "No, that's San Francisco." But facing it is what is the full name is the War Memorial Opera House.
That's right.
And in Europe, you would often have an important opera house facing a city hall or very important government building. The Ringstrasse in Vienna, the city hall is diagonal and 2 blocks away from the Vienna State Opera. It's a much more European thing than you typically find in the United States, and giving preeminence to a cultural building facing a government building is remarkable. And now a cluster of buildings has grown around it for the Symphony, the Davies Hall, and the neighborhood is called Hayes Valley. And it was when I first went to San Francisco in 1972, it was a bit of a rough neighborhood, but now there are restaurants, and it's a very fine part of town. But I find it so interesting and laudatory that government has been an important aspect in terms of the acknowledgement of opera, symphony, and ballet. And I'm going to add one more thing and then take it away. I was a very close friend of a man named Peter Henschel. And Peter, who died dramatically rather young of a heart attack, unfortunately, but was an incredibly passionate opera lover. And he was deputy mayor of San Francisco under Dianne Feinstein, and helped open San Francisco's relationships with China even before Nixon and just during Nixon, and was an artistic advisor to Prince Charles for a year. And he was a kayaker. He was everything. He was very passionate about the arts.
Yes.
One of his roles as deputy mayor, and correct me if this is wrong or has changed, was to be either on the board or the advisory council of the San Francisco Opera. And I had been to San Francisco before, but when I met Peter through his sister, a reporter for the New York Times, I came out there and discovered the degree to which city government was involved in a positive way in the support, the encouragement of the arts. I think what Peter told me was that his responsibility was the building more than dictating artistic policy, but because he was such a big personality and loved opera, especially when Leonard Bernstein conducted, he loved Mahler, he loved Wagner, he loved Strauss, the Germanic repertory. When that was on at the San Francisco Opera, Peter would just be in tears. But to what degree do you, as general director of the company, and did your predecessors interact with the government officials of San Francisco, something that in New York we don't have too much of?
I mean, there is this symbiotic link there. And as you say, Fred, not only the buildings proximate to each other, they're actually designed by the same architect, Arthur Brown. And so there's a aesthetic commonality about that whole area. I'm increasingly of the mindset that proximity and also the centrality, right? It's right. If you look at a map of the city, it's right there in the middle of the city. And there is something very symbolic about that, I think, in terms of, as you say, with a lot of the European countries cities where the opera house is like the meeting place. And it's the meeting, and it should be the meeting place of all peoples and all cultures. And it should be that universal point where people are welcomed in. And I think we want to get back to that idea of an opera house being that meeting place and a place where the stories of the city are told. I mean, that's, and you were talking about film earlier, and I think there's the commonality there again is there's a real storytelling art form. We have an obligation to be telling the stories of the city. And so I think that's very important to me. And the relationship with the city is a critical one. It may have been that Peter was on the opera board. There's also the War Memorial Board, which is a mayoral appointed board that oversees the collection of buildings there, the Opera House, Davies Symphony Hall, and then the Veterans Building, which I mentioned earlier, where the UN Charter was signed. And so they are appointed by the mayor, and they have responsibility for the physical infrastructure. But we are blessed at the moment to have an arts-friendly mayor in San Francisco, London Breed. She spent about a decade as the executive director of the African American Art and Cultural Complex, which is just down the road from the Opera House, just a few blocks away. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of rare as well, to have a mayor who has actually been an executive director of an arts organization. Mm. And I think that the need for that is never been greater anywhere, to be honest, than now. As we think about how we come back as not just organizations, but as a cultural fabric of a city. And in San Francisco, where the majority of our audience, 70% of our audience, comes from outside the city itself. Now, most of those are from the Bay Area, but they have to come across a bridge or a tunnel, and how those audiences are going to feel about coming back into a city after they've gone for 18 months or more without doing that. I think our city, every city, is going to have to do an amazing marketing job, basically, of saying we're back, we're alive, we're vibrant. This is, let us reclaim our humanity together in these great cultural centers. And I don't think any of us can take for granted that will happen automatically. And so, we're beginning those conversations increasingly with the city to say, how do we get that celebratory feel when the time is right? I mean, there's a lot to work through, but when the time is right, how do you reactivate the region to say, oh my goodness, this is why San Francisco is important to go to, the restaurants, the entertainment, the zeitgeist and the feel of the city itself. Yes, we want to be back there. So I think that relationship of art and city is never going to be called upon more than it needs to be called upon now.
You mentioned about doing art and operas that tell the tales of the city. There's a very famous author named Armistead Maupin who wrote a book
Right,
called Tales of the City that
right.
he now lives in London. And he's a wonderful, wonderful writer, and I commend his books to people. But I can think of at least two operas that have been done in San Francisco, one in your time and one before, that are about San Francisco topics. One of them, namely Harvey Milk, which
Yes.
was about he was on the board of supervisors and was assassinated. And Dianne Feinstein, now the senator, was a character of the opera.
Right.
And then Girls of the Golden West. Is that what's called?
Girls, girls.
Girls of the Golden West by John Adams. Tell us about that opera.
Oh goodness, that was 2017, and it was the second opera, the second world premiere that I was able to do in my tenure. But of course, it had begun with David Gockley, and he had commissioned John and Peter to do the piece, and it came, I think, out of the creative wellspring of both gentlemen. Peter had been reading around this topic of the California Gold Rush and the real California Gold Rush, and of course there's a certain amount of commentary in using that title on sort of setting the record straight from Puccini's interpretation of the California Gold Rush. And John, who has spent many years being up in that part of the world, and I mean literally sort of taking time up in gold country, so he knows the places very well. And they had come across this set of letters by a woman who became known colloquially as Dame Shirley, and she had come out with her.
That's not
husband.
Shirley Bassey.
Not Shirley Bassey, no. a little before. She had come out with her. I wonder if there's any relationship in the derivation. I don't know, but she had come out with her husband, who was a doctor around 1848. I'm going to say, and they had gone up into the mining camps up in the hills. And she chronicles with great vividness and poeticism in her diaries what it was like to be in the camps. And she was one of the very few women there, apart from the prostitutes. And she was writing these letters home to her sister on the East Coast, and they're amazing letters. And so this became the impetus for the opera. And it's full of color and energy. The minors' choruses, for example, just all of that rhythmic energy you get in John's music, but also it really delves into the issues of race as well, and the huge atrocities that were committed in this rush for wealth up in these mining communities, and one of the central stories about the persecution of this one particular woman, Josefa Segovia, who is essentially lynched because she had killed a miner who was trying to rape her. So it's a very powerful piece. It went on to Amsterdam a couple of years ago, where John had made some revisions to it, and then hopefully it'll be back in the States at some point. But it was. Josh Cosman, who writes for the Chronicle here, actually wrote a piece recently about this idea of California and the role that California plays in opera. And he made the good point that, when California is used in opera, it's always as a character. It's never just a place. And there is this sense of character in how it's used, whether it's in the Puccini or in the Harvey Milk or other pieces that we've done as well. Another interesting one, actually, Fred, was when we did The Bonesetter's Daughter, the Amy Tan book, which Stuart Wallace turned into an opera with Amy, about 3 generations of Chinese and Chinese American women in San Francisco, and the relationships they had, and the cultural tensions that they were facing as a family. And that was another interesting perspective on that, which is plays out in everyday life for so many people in the Bay Area. And of course now with the atrocities being committed in against the Asian American communities at the moment, and particularly against the elders in the Asian American communities. That piece has particular resonance, I think.
Which triggers another thought. I was telling you before about Peter Henschel and all of his trips to Shanghai and Beijing, but especially Shanghai early on. San Francisco is 1/3 Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
China is one of the real growth areas for opera. They're opening new buildings and theaters, and there's a Juilliard that is opening in China or has opened. And it's a real place for growth of our art form. And given San Francisco's historic but also linguistic connection and cultural connection to China, do you anticipate any kind of work with China for the company? As in touring, the Met went to Japan a lot, but I can see your company going to China.
We've definitely been in conversations around those things, and I've been out to China a few times in the last few years to meet with colleague companies there. The new opera we did by Bright Sheng, Dream of the Red Chamber, David Henry Hwang, which we did in 2016. That then went to China. Well, first of all, it went to Hong Kong, who were a producing partner. And then it went to China and played in Beijing and Wuhan and another city as well. And very well received. And it was very interesting because when we were talking with Bright and David Henry Hwang about the piece and about the piece going to China, I think we all assumed that there would need to be a Chinese language version done. When we produced it in San Francisco, we had vertical super titles on either side of this proscenium, but we assumed that it would have to be translated into Chinese. And as we got deeper into the project, we realized very emphatically that no, the Chinese wanted to hear it in English, because it was actually an affirmation that a great Chinese story, one of the kind of 4 canonical Chinese stories that so much of Chinese literature descends from, that it was being taken up by an American company and an American and translated into English. That was a great source of pride, and to have translated it back into Chinese would have kind of missed that sense that the piece was now moving into a more global perspective. So that was interesting, but that was very well received in China. And I think spoke a lot as well to the role that, again, as we think about which stories to put on the stage, that piece did so well in San Francisco because, again, it spoke to this sort of deep cultural, emotive history that was so important to the Chinese Americans in San Francisco. So, I mean, there is a huge, as you say, flourishing, particularly of buildings, right? I mean, the number of opera houses being constructed in China is just extraordinary, and is seen, I think, very much as a badge of pride and honor and importance in affirming the role of a city. There aren't necessarily the producing companies yet to fill those spaces with opera. So yes, we're thinking about what role can we play in that, and what kind of trans-Pacific connections can we make? And San Francisco Opera does have some history there. With Western Opera Theater, which was another extension of the Merrill program, which used to tour, Western Opera Theater went into China. It was one of the first cultural organizations to go in after the Cultural Revolution, and they toured there. But no, it's critically important, and to see a country that is paying that much growth opportunity to opera, I mean, you don't ignore that. Have you been to any of the? Have you been out there, Fred? Have you seen these facilities?
I've only been to China once. I wanted to climb the Great Wall of China on my 40th birthday, and I did it.
Yes.
That was 1996, and I traveled in China in 1996. So I know it's completely different now. It has to be incredibly different. But I'm steeped in Western opera, but I love Chinese opera.
Yeah.
And when I was in Beijing, I went to a couple of Chinese opera performances. And one of the things that struck me about China that I hadn't anticipated that I loved was the people love to laugh.
Mm-hmm.
The raucous laughter that I heard in China is wonderful. It's a bit like going to British, raw comedy, except that the British laugh let's call it knowingly, that they're recognizing what's funny and they laugh at the fact that they recognize it. You know what I mean?
Right,
You're British.
right.
But the
Referential.
Chinese, it was just an unbridled, fully emotional, full throttled laugh that I couldn't anticipate. And it was a delight. And I mention that because I wonder whether in planning to bring opera to China one day, that in addition to bringing some of the tragedies and dramas, you might want to bring a comedy, because I think that would be a very big hit for that reason.
Yeah. Oh, I
So,
love
and
that.
yeah. So I had tucked away a question about an hour ago that I'll ask you before I go on to the next big topic. Namely, you said that people like to dress up to go to the opera and that it's a special occasion. And the other thing, I get a lot of pushback from the opera community. I don't believe that people have to dress up, although they certainly can. But there's a certain, I went to Columbia University, and there's a very large community of opera goers at Columbia. And there's a special website for them. It's terrific. And a lot of the young people who go will wear a sweater, will wear a sweater and a skirt, whatever they wear, and they look great and fine. They're not dressed up. I know I've met many people who say, I can't go to the opera, I don't have the proper clothing, or I don't want to go to the opera, it's too stuffy, they dress up. But then you meet people who say, why did they arrive in a tattered t-shirt? Uh, I remember a couple of years ago at the Met that there was a couple, I don't know who gave them the seats, but they were dressed to go bowling or mow the lawn practically, but they were sitting in row T2 and 4 for Aida.
Mm-hmm.
And they just kind of stood out. And I don't judge them, but I know that the general director, people must say all the time, well, what do I wear? How do you answer?
I say whatever makes you feel comfortable in having that experience, and it has changed. And when I began at San Francisco Opera in 2005, Tuesday nights, which are the equivalent of like New York's Monday nights, the sort of society night, if you will, that's Tuesday night for us. And it was, at least in the boxes, it was black tie de rigueur. I mean, you had to wear black tie. And in fact, even in Houston, when I was at Houston before, opening nights, the staff all wore black tie. And so that was very natural then to go to San Francisco and see that in the boxes. And over that 15 years, that has just naturally atrophied. And there's maybe one or two people who still do it, which is absolutely fine. But the notion of a dress code in that way has disappeared from the opera house, I would say. I think we have to find a way to welcome people in who want to come from both perspectives, right? For some people, it is that they're coming to 5 or 6 performances of the same production potentially, and they want to be up in standing room reading the scores, and they want it to be a very casual experience. There are other people who are not even thinking about clothing as part of that experience, and then there are other people who very much think about clothing. And again, they want to dress up. They're coming into this venue, and just as if you go to a fancy restaurant, you might want to express yourself through clothes as well. So I think we're at a point where there is no house dress code. We just need to make sure that we and the entire system is welcoming of anyone who wants to express themselves through clothes. The Met was, for a while, and maybe still, until of course performances stopped, we're doing this photo blog, right? Of, I can't remember if it was Last Night at the Met or Best Dressed at the Met, mm-hmm. But they would have a photographer in the front of house taking photographs of audience members, and it was wonderful, just the variety of fashion they were highlighting. And again, people who want to express themselves through clothing, they should be able to, and whether that's dressing up or coming as you are. And in fact, we were just talking the other week about when things come back, should we should we have nights which are more costume themed? And
Mhm.
San Francisco is a great dress up town.
Yeah.
And we just did an online costume sale where people could buy costumes from Tannhäuser and a few Merry Widow, a few of the other of the iconic shows we've done, and like it sold out within hours. I mean, there was just such a demand for it, and so that's another aspect. Encouraging people to come in a more thematic sense. And I've always been intrigued about that with galas as well. I mean, galas are our opening night gala is still a sort of very formal affair. I wear white tie, and some others do as well. But it struck me when I came on in this job, the Opera Guild here did a gala, and they called it Nod to Mod, and it was this very British themed sort of fashion event, and it just struck me how much fun people had with that. There was way more fun than the kind of anxiety of like, which gown am I going to get? I mean, people were sort of really having fun just dressing up in a particular style. And I wanted to capitalize on that and just think through how do you encourage people just to have fun through clothing?
San Francisco is everybody's other favorite city. It's kind of like in Italy, when you ask an Italian where the best food is, they would say my town plus Bologna.
Yes.
Because same reason. But San Francisco, we all have an imagination about it and go there, have visited there. I have family there, so it means I come a lot, which I'm glad for. I've worked there a lot. But it also has a very distinct local community in terms of character, very diverse, but in terms of the arts, obviously. And as I said, it's the third oldest company, the Met 1883, Cincinnati 1920, San Francisco 1923. And I had the pleasure on January 1st of having Frederica von Stade as my guest on this show. And she lives nearby and is a great artistic and social presence, social in the sense not just of social life, but also helping needy children, fostering education, and so on. Jake
She's
Hagee,
amazing.
who began at San Francisco Opera not as a composer,
Right.
is a local composer. And you said John Adams lives north of there. And there is a very large artistic community that's not necessarily the film community, though there is that too. But when you merge that with the other defining thing of San Francisco now, namely tech,
Mm-hmm.
yes, we certainly have technology and all the Google and all the companies here in New York, and they're in Europe and so on. But the Bay Area is really that. And I've asked you this before, but I want to know your updated opinion. How does that factor in for the good and maybe the not so good in San Francisco in terms of opera and the arts?
I think the common through line there about the city, and again the iconic nature of the city, and I think you're right. San Francisco is one of those cities that does have this iconic visibility to it, whether it's through the Golden Gate Bridge or just sort of it's probably deeper in the sense of the history of the city and the kind of mindset of the city. That itself is iconic, I think. But this idea of being on the frontier, I think, is the underlying through line there. Whether it's, I mean, a city that can support the nature of the arts that we have. I mean, the city of San Francisco is 800,000 people. I mean, as a city itself, it's pretty small, and it's supporting, the great, opera, symphony, ballet, as well as museums and theater companies and so forth. That doesn't sort of compute if you look at the numbers, but it works because there's such a curiosity and such a fascination and such a desire to express oneself through the arts. So I think that if you look at the tech, why the tech sector makes sense there, it's because of this idea of curiosity, of breaking boundaries, of being at the cutting edge of something. The two haven't necessarily fused yet. And I think when I think about, because often we get the question of where's the tech money? Why are you guys not rolling in tech money? And my answer is we haven't inspired the individuals yet. I mean, the tech community is as diverse as any community, and it's It's just a collection of people. So the question is, how do we inspire the people who are working in that industry to be a part of who we are as a company? And there's no God-given right that they should just find their way to the opera house, right? We have to encourage them there. So I think that the relationship between Silicon Valley and San Francisco itself is kind of waxing and waning. There was a move of tech companies into San Francisco, maybe now out of San Francisco during the pandemic. So that itself has its own dynamic to it. But we're thinking a lot now about how do we as a company coming out of the pandemic much better find our voice on this more experimental side of things. I mean, I think it's a challenge for companies, particularly in more challenging financial times. You tend to kind of focus in more on the core and retrench into the core. And I think as we come out of the pandemic, we're saying, like, how do we just blow this open and start thinking much more experimentally as a company? Because in a way, we should have a license to do that based on where we are in the community, and the mindset of the Bay Area is one of not being shackled. And so I'm excited for what that means when we come out of this. I think there is a new frontier there for us as a company.
I'm going to generalize, but I find that when I think of people I know who are deeply involved in tech and who are creative in the tech sector, their strongest sense is not hearing and listening. They're visual, they're tactile, they're interactive, but not hearing and listening. And you notice that I'm making the distinction. We all hear if we have good ears,
right?
But
right.
We don't listen. And going to theater, going to opera, going to symphony, ballet is different because it's visual. Opera can be visual, but it requires listening. And when I've taken people who are in the tech world to an opera performance, and you know that I can prepare anyone to see any opera, but it's a challenge with them because they focus on the lighting, the costumes, on the narrative, on the LED screens, on all kinds of other things. And I even say to them, shut your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Just listen, get the story from the music. I prepared you. I told you her name is Violetta and she's at a party and she meets a guy. That's all you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
But let the music tell you what's going on. And because they're so focused on the delivery of imagery and information and words, it's hard to get them to pull back from that. And I wonder whether with your company and you cultivating that sector, whether to approach them initially just with the sound before introducing all the other elements, which obviously you can. And if I'm in San Francisco, I'll help you. But I think that's the way in. That's my opinion. I don't know what you think.
Well, and giving license to let yourself be in a different mind space. And actually, this is something where I have been curious because, there is definitely there's kind of a new wave of thinking happening in the Bay Area at the moment, I think, including in the technology community, about it's kind of like what's the second order impact of what we're doing. And there are some people who are really beginning to think about that now and write about it and talk about it in terms of what is this doing to society, and in a way that's tied up with the growth in mindfulness as well. And there are some interesting intersectionalities of that going on in the Bay Area at the moment, as there is this there's still the frenzy of creation, but there is also, I think, a growing culture of we need to balance that somehow with greater mindfulness, with meditation, and there is a strong undercurrent of that. And so I'm intrigued by that as well, because that is what we do for a living, right? We are basically a mindfulness organization. We succeed by taking people deep into themselves and giving them permission to be in a state of catharsis. So I think there's some interesting things there as well, where as the technology sector sort of moves into a new mature phase potentially, how do we play that role of of answering that question of how do I find the space, how do I find the perspective, and I think it's also a generational thing, not in the sense of, a lot of people who were in tech in the early 2000s and so forth. I mean, they're young people. They have, either they're completely in their office doing the work, or maybe they're raising young families, and so we're also sort of, we have to deal with that as well. And so I think as people mature through their own lives and have more time, more focus, I mean, in a way, going after the tech sector means going after the demographic who generally doesn't have the time to sit in an opera house, or isn't prioritizing their time in that way because they have young families and they're just in a swirl of activity. It doesn't mean they won't get to us when they reach their late 40s, 50s, and so forth. So I'm excited for what can happen there, but it just struck me, like in the last year or two, I think there's something around mindfulness where we can play a role too.
One of my very favorite operas is Berlioz's Les Troyens. And I travel when it's being performed, especially because your company presented it with Anna Maria Antonacci, who, for reasons I'll never understand, has never sung at the Met. She's a magnificent artist. And you had her for two operas. You had her for Marco Tutino's Two Women, based on film of Sophia Loren, and I interviewed her before. She was in Geneva. I was in New York. Sophia Loren lives in Geneva. And I tried to set up a meeting with them, but Sophia was out of town. But it would have been wonderful to have the woman playing the role in the opera meet the woman who played on film. But the other opera was Les Troyens, in which she played Cassandra. And it came to my mind, why? Because you were talking about catharsis. And you could have promoted that as Catharsis in Carthage. You didn't see where I was building to.
I like it. Brad.
But now let's talk about monumental opera, taking our cue from Les Troyens. I asked you to join me today back in November.
Yes.
And I didn't know at the time, and maybe you didn't know at the time, that you were contemplating as a company presenting online your ring cycle that I attended in 2018. Just full disclosure, you asked me to lead the ring symposium. I led it. I had a family emergency and I left Brunhilde on a rock. I don't know what happened to her. The family emergency worked out fine, but I never saw the complete production. So I too am looking forward to seeing the whole thing. Good. And you're doing a ring festival symposium around it this time online.
That's right.
And I'll be on March 20th with Jamie Barton. We're talking about dining on the Rhine, food, wine, and the ring.
I'm so excited for that.
You're having all kinds of stuff. Matthew, when did you decide to do this? What prompted you to do it? And talk about it. I'm told the listeners that I asked you in November because you're not here today because of that. I asked you, we know each other, and I asked you a while ago.
Right. Well, when the pandemic began, we quickly started looking at how we could share our content. And we are one of the few American companies, other than the Met, that has been regularly capturing. In fact, I think probably the only company that's been regularly capturing in the last decade or so. And so we have this treasure trove of titles that we have captured. And much of that was for a program we had until a few years ago called Opera Vision, where you had screens in the balcony. And so we relayed the close-ups so that people in the balcony could see the emotion on the singers' faces and so forth. So we had this amazing treasure trove of content. And, as with anything media-wise, there's a complex interplay of rights clearances that you have to work through before you can just share it. So we had a little bit of work to do before we could start doing that. But we've started doing that last year. And every weekend we now have a title on the website for free of charge for the public to see, and it's up for basically the period of the weekend, and then donors and subscribers can then see it afterwards. So we knew that the ring was a possibility for that, and we were eager to think about that, but it needed a little bit of editing and so forth before it was ready for prime time. So as we thought about when it became clear that the pandemic was continuing, we said, well, let's put the ring on. We'll make it a real focus. We'll do it do it over a month, each of these weekend slots, again, free for people to watch the actual ring itself. And as that developed, our director of marketing, Catherine Appleton, began, speculating about, well, what if we actually make it into a festival? And, the connective power of the ring is not just in the music, it's in the conversation. It's about the interplay of, you're with people for 16 hours and you are generally wanting to immerse yourself in it for more than those 16 hours by going to the lectures, going to the symposiums. That's such an important part of the ring experience for so many people. And what you do, Fred, to bring that alive for people all around the world is just indicative of that. So she began piecing together what a festival could look like, and it's really exciting how it's come together. And people are buying these festival passes. So the ring itself is free. There's a small charge for the festival, ancillary content around it.
And the website is sfopera.com.
If you go to sfopera.com, if you want to go straight there, if you're rushing and want another quick link, just go to sfopera.com/ring, and you'll see the kind of content that is on there. And you can buy a festival pass, or you can buy individual items as well. But we've got a conversation with Alex Ross and Tony Kushner about Alex's new book. We've got some experiences with the cast, so you can have a conversation with Brandon Jovanovic, Karita Matala. We've got a conversation around being Brunhilde and three of the people who have sung Brunhilde in San Francisco: Nina Stemma, Jane Eaglin, Irene Teorin. We've got your wonderful session with Jamie Barton, Fred. And then we've got some more focused sessions on some of the themes that Francesca Zambello really made prominent in this. But there's a lecture on environmentalism, a lecture on feminism. And we also have a wonderful session with Grace Bunbury talking about being the first Black singer in Bayreuth. So she's being interviewed by Kenneth Overton for that. So just a wonderful array of content over the course of the month. And as I've thought about like what we've missed and what we are missing in this time of such silence from our stages. And I think one is that emotional, vibrational energy of being in a room with a singer. And I'll come back to that in a second, actually. But the second one is just being in community with other people, experiencing an artwork. And it's made me think a lot about the nature of an opera house. And an opera house it's not just a convenient way for in our case, 3,000 people to see something at the same time. Being there in communion with other people is part of the experience. It's what makes it so rich. The fact that you're bawling your eyes out at the end of an opera as someone's dying on stage, sitting next to a complete stranger. I mean, where else does that happen in the world? So that communal
when the San Francisco Giants play the Yankees.
Oh yeah,
one of us cries.
A lot of good parallels there. But I come back to this vibrational energy piece. I just wanted to mention this because this came up a few days ago. We had an event called Meet the Adlers, where Adler sponsors and so forth got to spend time with young artists, and then the new leadership of the program as well, Carrie Ann Matheson and Marcus Beam. And we've been working with this new technology with a firm in Sweden that allows people to make music without any latency from two different places. And we had an example of that in the session, but we also had the Adlers talking about it. And it was so moving because the Adler pianist was saying how much it meant to him to hear a singer breathe. And that, he is not, because a pianist is responding so much to the breath, and they're taking their cues from the breath. And he said, like, I've gone for a year without actually just hearing a singer breathe, because when you're layering these tracks on one at a time, you miss that. And it was a very emotional moment actually to hear them talking about that, because you realize that one small little thing, hearing a breath, now has so much meaning for somebody. And I just thought, if that one little breath can have so much meaning for an artist, what it's going to feel like when we all get to hear, something like The Ring again live. It's going to be a completely different experience than when we heard it a few years ago, because we will be carrying all of that release of just what that means now. So it's in that one breath was a very great sense of what lies ahead for us, I think.
As you know, I created this series, Fred Plotkin on Fridays, around one word: inspiration. And inspiration is breathing.
Yes.
That's what it is. And
Yes.
inspiration comes from drawing in breath and with that drawing in life. And
Yes.
I connected completely. And although obviously I'm not an opera singer, I went and studied singing at the start of my opera career to know what they have to do and how they breathe.
Yes.
And having learned that opened so many other things to me about opera, which is why I encourage everybody to learn to sing, even if you don't plan to become a singer. I want to mention that I had Alex Ross as my guest here in November, and you can go to YouTube and enter Fred Plotkin on Fridays, Alex Ross. And we obviously talk about Wagner. He was a wonderful guest. Matthew, I raised it in passing, but there's a lot to this. There is the opera baseball connection.
Yes.
You're from Britain. Did you grow up with cricket, or was that not a sport for you at the time?
Oh, I am a hopeless sports person, Fred. I
Okay,
mean,
that's
yes,
all right.
yes, we had cricket lessons and so forth. But I was definitely the person who got picked on the last on the team. You know, if that gives you
That's
any
okay.
indication.
No, I asked
But,
because there is definitely an opera baseball connection, and it's not a slight thing. And I know people who like ballet, like football, American football, and perhaps soccer, but opera and baseball really is a thing.
mhm.
And there are many opera singers, Michael Fabiano, who you know, Andrew Garland, who have very strong baseball connections. Robert
Yes,
Merrill, the baritone, sang at Yankee Stadium. Many of our singers
amazing.
sing in ballparks. And what I love about opera and baseball is the sense of protagonism that happens. That the batter at a certain point is the diva, the divo, the person doing the solo. And everybody has their moment. And I've known many opera lovers, fans in New York, for whom their season is that they go to the Metropolitan Opera and in the past New York City Opera from September into about early May.
Hmm.
And the baseball season would begin in the very end of March into April, but then really kick in the summer when the opera was away. And then because the Yankees are a good team, they often would wind up in the World Series or the playoffs into October. And I have known so many opera lovers who shuttle between the two places, between the ballpark and the opera house. And in the past, before we had certain technology, they would have a little wire in their ear listening to the Yankee game while watching an opera at the Met. I remember once in San Francisco, the Giants were playing in the World Series, and I was at an opera in October. And suddenly on the screen, I remember Joyce DiDonato was singing, I forget the opera, but I remember that it flashed on the title screen that the Giants had won, and the audience burst into cheers, and Joyce took a bow. And you present opera at, I forget the name of the stadium, AT&T Park,
It was AT&T, now Oracle Park, but yes,
Oracle
the home of
Park,
the
yeah.
Giants. Yeah.
And I've been with opera lovers from San Francisco to baseball games, and I've seen operas in Oracle Park. And the great thing there is you can have wonderful food, crab, and all these things at Oracle Park. The food is terrific there.
It is.
And
It is.
watching an opera. Talk about that.
You know, it's when David Gockley was in Houston, he had done these simulcasts, plaza casts in front of the Opera House there. And when he moved to San Francisco, we started doing them in the city. And the first two we did in Civic Center. So again, we kind of kept the proximity to the Opera House. But it was you had to kind of rent the screens, you had to put the infrastructure in, and it was costly and also not a huge space to do it in. And so we had read, this was 2007, that the Giants were putting in what was at the time the largest HD video jumbotron screen. I think in advance of one of the All-Star games, I think it was. And so, we immediately picked up the phone to the Giants and said, "Hey, what do you think?" It's like, here's a huge screen. You have a huge venue. Let's do this. And they were so receptive. And the Giants have been on the front edge of using their stadium for other things. They are the I think the team in America that has been most forward looking in that from the beginning. And so we have a wonderful partner there, Stephen Revetria, who immediately saw the value of this, and it's just grown and grown. I think we had over 30,000 people for our biggest one, and it's beautiful. I mean, and there's something again about the focus of a baseball stadium. You're looking at kind of at the same thing as opposed to a football stadium where you're kind of in the round. In a baseball stadium, you're much more focused. And in San Francisco, you're looking out to the bay as well. So, particularly from the upper levels. So you have this amazing view going on there. So it's kind of presentational and the pacing and so forth. And it's just been this amazing marriage of the two companies. And that in and of itself has become an iconic thing, I think, in San Francisco, that marriage of sports and opera through the relationship with the Giants. So I love those things. I mean, there's nothing like seeing that many people experiencing opera live. I know it's on the screen, but they react viscerally. They cheer, they boo, they have a great time with it. So, and it's interesting. It goes back to your question about clothing and so forth. I mean, this perception of all the barriers to opera. So much of those are around people not being sure what they need to do and when. And at the ballpark, of course, there's no barriers. People can get up, they can go and get another beer or garlic fries or whatever at whatever point. And what's amazing always to me is that people don't. People are, there's just a natural, they are focused on this story unfolding in front of them, and they're just there. They're in the moment. They know, they feel when to clap. Again, it's stripped away of all of the artifice, and yet that storytelling power of opera just pulls everyone into this common moment of just being there with the art. So it's those are glorious.
That's a good use of tech.
Oh yeah,
in a way of explaining and promoting it to people in the tech sector who might be resistant. So listeners know that I asked my guests to provide selections from the Adagio catalog that inspired them. And you were talking about Carita Mattila before. She recently appeared in a one-woman show in Helsinki called COVID Fan Tutte.
I know.
And you selected a selection from the Glyndebourne 1930s production of Così fan tutte.
That's right.
Tell me why. Was it the Glyndebourne? Was it the Così?
Well, Così is one of my favorite operas, and so definitely that has something to do with it. But this performance was from 34, I think, which was the first year of the Glyndebourne Festival. And so there's something very magical about that, this idea of a new beginning of something that was going to go on and become such an important part of British musical fabric. And the elegance of Fritz Busch's conducting, I mean, you just feel such a sense of style and of naturalness to it. And then, singers who, we don't know that well now, but Ina Suez, American singer, and Hedel Nash. I love the lyricism he brings to this. I'd sort of chosen the Fiordiligi Ferrando duet in Act 2, where Fiordiligi begins to give in to Ferrando, although I always think it's both of them giving into each other. I mean, Ferrando is being as pulled into this as she is, but there's just something about that, hearing in sound what that must have been like in Glyndebourne in that first season, and which interestingly, the inception for that had been Salzburg Bayreuth, and this idea that England could have a similar festival, and that they started in such an amazing way with these series of Mozart operas. I love closing my eyes and just kind of, I never went to the original Glyndebourne Theatre, but imagining myself, in this idyllic countryside, just with nothing but opera and sheep surrounding you, and so it has a very evocative quality for me, I think.
There are only 4 great opera theaters or festivals that I've never seen an opera in. I've worked for Glyndebourne, but I've never been there. I've done work for them from elsewhere. Yeah. The others being the Houston Grand Opera, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
Never. Sydney, where I was supposed to actually work in 2001, but then 9/11 happened here and I canceled my Australia plans. The only time I've canceled a contract because it was important to stay in New York. And I've been to the Bolshoi, but only for ballet, but never opera.
Okay.
So I still need to do those.
Well, Fred, you're way ahead of me. I've got a lot still to do. So
you're younger. You'll do it. Don't worry. Another one that you selected, obviously Siegfried surprises me not at all. We've discussed The Ring and Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6. Any particular reason?
Oh, this recording with Evgeny
Ravinsky and the Leningrad
Brinsky.
Symphony, yeah.
Oh my goodness. It's just, I remember very vividly the first time I heard this recording, and just the complete and utter connection between conductor and orchestra, and what Mavrinsky is able to do with the Leningrad Philharmonic is just extraordinary, because he takes all of these risks in that recording because there's so much trust there. And the recording is, I think, 1960. He began with them as principal conductor in 38, but had been conducting already a few years before that. And then he continued until his death in 88. And so it's just this complete utter trust between orchestra and conductor. And he's able to get sounds and textures out of that. Sometimes you feel like you're listening to Götterdämmerung in it, because it's just the depth of the brass sound, and the then going into the sort of stateliness at the end of the first movement there. And I just never tire of listening to that recording, Fred, because it just shows me what is capable in terms of taking artistic risks if you have the trust.
In American English, we say that we studied. In England, you say that you read, and you read music at
right.
Christ Church College at Oxford, where I've had the pleasure of teaching, and it's magical just to be in those halls.
Oh my goodness.
But you specialized in Jean-Baptiste Lully.
That's
and
right.
I would have thought you might have chosen a selection by Lully, but instead it's Jean-Philippe Rameau. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I spend this time in Oxford studying, a somewhat obscure set of manuscripts that had been created from Lully operas to be used for home entertainment, like chamber ensembles by the Dean of Christ Church. And they were sitting in the Christ Church library, and I spent a summer sort of researching the provenance of these fragments of handwritten manuscripts based on the Lully operas. And Lully operas had not been performed in the UK at that time, I don't think. And so that was very interesting, but it really led me into getting to know the French Baroque repertoire. And Rameau has just become such a passion for me. And what Lully began, he just took to another level, particularly harmonically. And he wrote this very, very important treatise on harmony, which sort of defined sort of the foundation of post-Renaissance harmony in many ways. And you just feel that in the music, the certainty of the harmonic progression, and the way he uses harmony to create rhythmic energy as well. I mean, some of the most amazing rhythmic moments that I've ever heard have been in Rameau. This particular piece is the other extreme, particularly in this recording, where this is a moment from his opera Castor and Pollux towards the beginning of the opera, and it's a funeral lament, and it's a piece that I just adore. It's one of the most evocative pieces of music I know. And then this recording by Theodor Karensis, it kind of actually reminds me a little bit of the Mravinsky recording, in that, again, his relationship with his ensemble in Perm, Russia, is just like that. I mean, they rehearse like nonstop together, and they have this complete and utter understanding. And he slows this piece down to almost like time just standing still. It's almost painful, like you're waiting for the next note, and you want the next note, and it just takes slightly longer than you think it should. And it's a very risky recording in some ways, but to me it works fabulously, because you do feel like time just being bent and stretched. So it's that has been a piece that I've just long adored, and was this particular recording to me just takes it to the extreme.
And finally, I have done this program now for 10 months. You are the first guest to pick a composer I've never heard of. Edgar Leslie Bainton.
Yes.
Tell me, please.
Well, I mean, he is one of those romantic English composers who really specialized in church music. And as I was just looking up a little information about him, and it was interesting because a tie-in to what we were talking about with Glyndebourne, and Glyndebourne was set up from the visit of Christie to Bayreuth and seeing the festival there. And in that same year, 34, was when Bainton moved to Australia. So he was on the move at that point as well. But he had visited Bayreuth in 1914 to see the festival, and actually was arrested there at the outbreak of war, and was spent 4 years as a prisoner of war in Germany. And before he was released, and then sort of began his musical journey. But there's so much of that British Romanticism in his music. This particular anthem for me is "And I Saw a New Heaven." There's so much drama in it. The kind of drama that you can find in a cathedral setting, of huge swath of emotion still in a piece of religious music. And when I was at Oxford, I was at Christ Church, as you say, which is where the cathedral choir is housed. And so people come from around the world to hear that choir, and they evensong in particular. Well, on Monday nights, the choir, they have to have a night off at some point. So, because British choirs sing every night. So Monday nights, the choir had off. And so the college choir would sing instead. And I was in the college choir. And every week you saw the horror on people's faces when the congregation, when they realized they were not hearing the famous Christchurch Cathedral choir, rather they were hearing the Christchurch College choir. But this piece we did actually sing in one of the Monday night services, and so that's where I got to know it. And again, it's just this wonderful miniature, and sort of builds and builds. It's based on a text from Revelations, and you hear the end of it, and this line, "God shall wipe away all tears, for the former things are passed away," and it just undoes me every time I hear it. And I actually got to hear it in a funeral a few years ago in Grace Cathedral. They did it for a funeral, and then it's such a powerful piece of music. And what's interesting for me is the English Romanticism style was something I really pushed back on when I was growing up. I just could not find a resonance with the music of Elgar or Holst, and it was just something which didn't speak to me at all. And it's interesting, every passing year that I've been out of the UK, that has just felt more and more. I understand it more and more. So probably a sense of nostalgia, the painting of the British countryside in music. But yeah, if you'd asked a 20-year-old me if I'd have put a piece like this on my list now, I would have said absolutely not. So it's interesting how musical tastes change. And
I listened last night, and I thank you for it. I'm going to study him more. I'm a great lover of Ray Vaughan Williams, one of my very favorites.
Yeah.
And my full name is Frederick, and my parents named me. There were 3 Fredericks they agreed on, although for different reasons. And one of them is Frederick Delius, who was one of my father's favorite composers. So I grew up with the Village Romeo and Juliet and the Florida Suite and all of that music. You reminded me, and then I'll let you go, about Christchurch and that beautiful space. The last time I was there in a work capacity, Jessie Norman was on a book tour for her autobiography, and she was there speaking. And I was there, it was 2014, the anniversary of Richard Strauss's birth, teaching Richard Strauss. And I knew Jessie Norman from our time at the Met together. Right. And we met up, and we were surrounded by students, and they started asking us questions about Richard Strauss. So I said to her, "You're good at improvisation. Let's teach a class here about Richard Strauss." And we sat down for 90 minutes with these students from Christchurch and taught Richard Strauss. And that was the last time I saw her. And so, what I associate, pardon me?
What year would that have been?
That was March of 2014, April of 2014. Okay. Yeah.
That means a lot, because Christchurch was where I discovered really Richard Strauss, and studied him at some depth. And so that was a great sort of awakening for me in terms of Strauss and understanding Strauss. So that story resonates.
Well, you will want, and listeners will want, to read up about Strauss's visit to Oxford, which I didn't know about until I was preparing for that. But he was received with great acclaim, and he had a good time in Oxford. How can one not, actually?
I know. When I was there, Fred, I came away after my English degrees are only 3 years, and I came away thinking that was the most amazing experience, but it's kind of not the real world. After a couple of years, I was like, it's just a very nice version of the real world. I mean, it's its own little bubble in many ways, but it's a place of such curiosity, of such inquiry, of such, I think the concentration of music making per square inch is probably greater than anywhere else in the world, because there is so much happening in that city. So I'm glad you got to spend some good time there.
I love it. I miss it, actually. I've never been to Cambridge, and my Cambridge friends are all very resentful of that fact. And my Oxford friends say, well, there's nothing to see there.
Exactly. A healthy rivalry.
Matthew, thank you for a very inspiring conversation. I think what listeners got today that I knew about you, but I learn more every time I talk to you, is the many facets that make a general director of an opera company. And it's not simply about negotiating contracts, important though that is, and about keeping everybody happy, important though that is, but it's a connection to the larger whole of a city, of a community, of a society, and of presenting art at a time when people don't immediately think to turn to art, when in fact we need it now more than ever. So I thank you, and I thank you for your good work.
Fred, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you and just to talk about art making and to talk about what lies ahead of us. And I'm just so grateful for all you do to inspire a passion for arts in people. And I really encourage everyone to tune into your Ring event as part of our Ring Festival, because that's going to be.
Can I have garlic fries? I don't have that garlic fries on the Rhine, but
are you going to be? Are you actually cooking on the show, or are you just talking about?
No,
food?
I don't think so. But I may bring out, some wine or something. I'll
Excellent.
have to talk to Jamie and decide what we're going to do.
Excellent.
Thank
Fred,
you
it's
so
such
much.
a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. See you soon. Be well.
Take care, Fred. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.